Hello. In this video, I want to answer a relevant question, and that is, can demographic growth actually lead to a downfall of a civilization? Let me first start with a pretty obvious observation, and that is, most historians agree that empires and civilizations were at the peak of their power at a time when they were demographically doing well, when they experienced demographic growth. A Roman Empire is a great example of that. At their peak of their military and economic power in the period that's often called Pax Romana, we are talking about the 1st and the 2nd century, Rome also had a pretty good demographic picture, but as the demography of Roman society declined, their military power declined, they were attacked by Persia and by the barbarians, and eventually their civilization was destroyed. Let us also look at the population of Russia that roughly represents what happened in the entire Soviet Union. So we can see that at the peak of Soviet power, they were actually experiencing a pretty good demographic growth. We are talking about a period when Soviet Union was also at the peak of its reputation. Stalin had just defeated Hitler, and the Soviets were seen as liberators of many oppressed people in the European colonies. And also many believed that Soviets will be able to colonize the space faster than the Americans. So the Soviet population is also at its peak when Soviet civilization is experiencing a peak of its power. It is also, I would argue, not a coincidence that Europe held pretty much all of Africa in a time period when Europe was actually demographically doing much better than Africa. And I'm not even saying that demography is end-all be-all when it comes to state power, but numerical advantage definitely counts. The Soviets were partially able to defeat the Nazis precisely because of their advantage in manpower, and the Russian Empire also often used its manpower in order to defeat its enemies. For example, the Brusilov offensive in World War I is a great example of that. And here we can see that Russia's demography today is doing pretty bad, and the war in Ukraine is just accelerating this process. But many military and economic experts actually agree that one of the reasons for Putin's invasion was his crazy attempt to fix Russia's demography by stealing Ukrainian children from their parents and raising them as Russians. And of course he also wanted to steal oil and grain from Ukraine. But that's not a topic of this video. The topic of this video is actually answering the question that I asked in the beginning, and that is, can demographic growth actually lead to something bad happening, to a downfall of civilization, or to a civilization becoming less developed and in the end being conquered by its enemies. In most cases, as I already said, demographic growth is linked with economic and military prosperity, but there is one pretty important counterexample, and that is China in the 18th century. But let us first take a look at what happened with China in the 17th century in order to understand this weird phenomenon that China experienced in the 18th century. So what happened in the 17th century is known as a Little Ice Age. All across the world temperatures dropped, and in Europe they also caused massive problems, but in China situation was particularly bad. the mini ice age caused famines. In some parts of China there were droughts, and in other parts of China there were floods due to this weird cooling that was happening all around the world. And after the heavy rains, the locusts attacked the rice fields and made famines even worse for the Chinese peasants. The early 17th century was a truly horrible time for China. They lost somewhere around 30 million people, some experts say, and this also led to huge peasant rebellions, since the emperor lost all respectability because he was unable to prevent famines, which in the eyes of the Chinese peasants meant that he is not a true emperor, that he does not reflect the will of the sky, as the Chinese people used to say. And actually that is when something also important happens. A man named Nurhaci unites the Manchurians, and he decides to use this huge crisis that was happening in China in order to conquer it and establish the Manchurian dynasty, which is in the end exactly what happens. After 40 years of bloody war, the Manchurians are able to conquer China and create their own dynasty. Later they call themselves the Qin dynasty, and many Ming generals even supported them because they don't want peasant rebels to take power. That is for them the worst case scenario, and they even prefer foreign nobility to their own peasants taking power. And so the Qin dynasty is established, one of the most powerful dynasties in the entire Chinese history. They were able to significantly expand Chinese territory and conquer the surrounding areas. Here on this map you can see all the areas that were conquered during the Qin dynasty. And they were able to do it partially because under them China experienced rapid demographic growth that was rarely seen in history. But this growth also created a lot of difficulties and in a way forced them to attack their neighbors. Due to deforestation and rapid consumption of resources, the Chinese people were kind of forced to colonize their neighbors because they simply had no more resources to spend on their own land. They were depleted of resources, and that's why they started a series of wars with their neighbors. First, they expanded their territory in a war with the Russian Empire. Then they moved to the nomadic Zanguri people that lived in the western parts of what became China, and their territories, after they were ethnically cleansed and genocided, were populated by the Hui Muslim population that is, ironically enough, today also ethnically cleansed and genocided by China. And the Taiwanese indigenous population was also colonized and ethnically cleansed. And this phenomenon is often compared with what happened to the Indians in the United States. Roughly, we are speaking about the same process. In both areas of the world, rapid population growth forced the colonizers to expand their territory and ethnically cleanse indigenous people. But in China, the demographic growth was even more rapid, which created many problems. And the reason for that is probably the fact that the Chinese women got married earlier than European women in this period, which is why they had more children than the Europeans. And one of the ways in which the Chinese state dealt with this huge increase in demography, that was a product of a sudden period of peace and stability after 40 years of bloody war and drought and famine, well, they introduced potatoes into the Chinese society, and that enabled them to live in the hilly, in the mountainous parts of China. But even that wasn't enough, which is why they were forced to build multiple dams all across China in order to create more fertile land and more living space for the Chinese people. But very soon, in the 19th century, the flaws of this solution became obvious, as many of the dams were built illegally and they actually collapsed, creating massive catastrophes. And even today, the problem of dams and of dams not being built with enough precision is a big problem in China, and massive floods continue to damage Chinese society even to this day. And a Chinese writer of the mid-18th century actually wrote, "If people take all they can, if they do not restrain themselves, their power is enough to wear out both heaven and the earth." So these Malthusian fears first began to appear in China in the 18th century. Many of their intellectuals and bureaucrats are kind of concerned with this rapid demographic growth. They simply don't know what to do about it, as the resources are being depleted, and something obviously needs to be done, because there won't be enough resources for the Chinese people. And also rapid deforestation is a huge problem for the Chinese people in this period. And in a Malthusian view of the world, this is how actually rapid population growth is related to resources. Malthus famously claimed that if we allow the population of humans to grow rapidly, we will just run out of resources, and that will create collapse. And in some parts of China, population growth wasn't as rapid and as destructive, simply because they had this ancient custom of killing female babies, female infanticide as it is called. So the demographic problems were actually the worst in the outer regions of China, where they didn't kill female babies. But yeah, what also needs to be said, like in the Roman Empire or like in the Soviet Union, the Chinese were at the peak of their military power during the Qin dynasty. The huge demographic growth that occurred as a product of stability and higher birth rates generally made it possible for the Qin dynasty to conquer pretty much almost all of their neighbors, at least to an extent, and to make China a truly or one could say even a much more powerful economic and military superpower than it was previously. But this huge demographic growth also damaged the Chinese society in a very bizarre way. And this is why I want to use actually this as an example of demographic growth actually hurting society, which is not something that often happens. Or let me be more precise, demographic growth often leads to worse working conditions for an average person. But from a perspective of the empire, from the perspective of state power, demographic growth is almost always good for economic growth and for military growth and for conquering your neighbors. But in this case, it actually wasn't good even for that. It wasn't good even from a purely military and economic growth perspective. Yes, they did expand rapidly, but very soon in the 19th century they experienced a century of humiliation. The Chinese population at that time is at 400 million, which is enormous, but yet the British are able to humiliate them in the Opium Wars and colonize them and force the Chinese society to experience a century of humiliation. Well, why is that the case? How were the Europeans able to force China to experience such humiliation and control their tariffs and force them to buy opium and generally control their markets? Well, China never experienced in the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, when that very same process was occurring in Europe and allowing Europe to create weapons and a very powerful navy that the Chinese people at the time didn't have. And well, why is that the case? Why was there no Industrial Revolution in China? Well, Malthus and many other economists that agree with him actually claim that it was precisely this rapid demographic growth that caused a lack of industrial development in China. Let me explain why. So, because of this rapid demographic growth, Chinese peasants were forced to compete with each other, and therefore they were forced to lower the prices of their goods to an absurdly low level, and therefore the Chinese factories couldn't compete with the peasants, and there was no need to create machinery that was later used by Europeans for war as well, simply because the prices were already so low in China of the 18th century that nobody even needed to invest in machinery in order to create more goods and therefore lower their prices. And yeah, therefore I would actually agree with this kind of, on the first glance, weird Malthusian thesis, but I definitely think it still holds some weight, and most historians today agree that rapid demographic growth was one of the reasons for the fact that China never industrialized, and or at least not in the 18th century, and was therefore conquered by the Europeans. But some others also talk about the fact that China was simply too centralized economically, and that therefore they didn't have enough freedom to develop economically in the same way in which Europe did. But actually, yeah, what happened in the 18th century in China is an example of demographic growth causing stagnation of a civilization and eventually fall of a civilization into 100 years of humiliation and European dominance over the Chinese civilization.